thrilled with so many atheists and skeptics and humanists all under one roof here in Houston, Texas. It's a great time to be a free thinker in Houston. Our community and the movement in general are growing so fast and gaining so much momentum and energy like never before. Here in Houston, we currently have several great Freethought groups. The Houston Church of Freethought, the Houston Skeptic Society, the Humanists of Houston, who I especially want to thank for paying for this today, and I would like to encourage everybody to contribute if they can. And then there's the Houston Atheists, which is the group that I'm the organizer for, and I've been asked to talk a little bit about that group. The Houston Atheists is the world's largest atheist community. We have over 1,600 members and a wide variety of activities that fill up our calendar every month. Every month we have about 9 to 10 different dinners in various places all over the greater Houston area. We have several coffee socials, usually a couple bar meetups, as well as a women's group, a book club, and family events. We also have, and lots more. This month in June, coming up, we also have, we're going to be going to a drive-in movie theater. We're going to go to the beach. We're going to a winery, a star party, dog park. We're going to go to the Science Museum. Actually, the Science Museum is July 1st, so that's not quite in June, but we've got a lot going on. And we hope to be adding a lot of things very soon. We're currently working on some classes, some educational classes on biblical criticism, counter-apologetics, and I guess other methods of deconstructing religion and Christianity, which I think is going to be very exciting. We're also hoping to put on a blood drive very soon. And as we continue to grow and expand, we're looking at providing a lot more opportunities for various forms of volunteering, activism, education, and of course a wide range of social events. We also have a very active Facebook group for our members to interact, continue interacting outside of our meetup events. Just a lot going on. You can find out more by Googling Houston Atheists or visiting HoustonAtheist.org, or out on the table outside. We have a lot of business cards and brochures with some more information about us. I hope you check us out, and hope we see you around. And I will now turn it over to Vic, who is one of the co-organizers for the Houston Atheists and also the vice president for the Humanists of Houston.
All right, thanks a lot, Kurt. All right, so we first met our guest speaker at last October's Texas Freethought Convention here in Houston. I know a lot of familiar faces here who attended. No insignificant risk to himself, as he was actually the head pastor of a local at the time, as well as the former head pastor of one of the largest churches in the Houston area. After first meeting him, we were immediately inspired by his courage in taking that bold and risky first step into the world of free thought and secularism, while at the same time still having his other foot firmly planted in the world of Scripture and faith. Since then, we've continued to be inspired by his courage as he begins to move into the next phase of his life and leaves behind the world of religion that he has occupied for so long. In just the short time since he came out as an atheist on MSNBC and left the ministry, he has spoken at the American Atheists National Convention in Washington, D.C. He's been interviewed by Richard Dawkins regarding his experience in the Clergy Project, which is a program for ministers who no longer believe. And he has become a secular officiant in Margaret Downey's Secular Celebrations organization. Please welcome our guest speaker, former pastor Mike Ouse, as he shares his story of how he has reached this point in his life and where he'll be heading from here.
Thank you so much, Vic, for the very nice intro. Let's just get right into it. For most of my life, most of my adult life, I had been a practitioner of the world's second oldest profession. For for 17 years in a mainline Protestant church, and then for the past couple of years in an independent, more progressive congregation. I haven't always been a skeptic. I did grow up in the church. I was raised in the church. And when I got into the ministry gig, I did it with the best of intentions at the time. I really did pretty much believe all the doctrines, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried, descended into hell, and the third day he rose again. I saw somebody try to stand up when I said that. So my drift away from faith was gradual. It began really just over the years by jettisoning one doctrine after another. I thought, well, do you really have to believe in the virgin birth? No, that's not really that important, And you start going through the list. You don't really have to believe in a literal devil. He's just kind of this literary device, as a personification of evil, but not an actual entity. And so I started working my way down the list, and then I got, he didn't really rise from the dead. He was resurrected in the hearts of his believers, and they carried on, his ministry and were inspired. And then one day I woke up and it's like, there ain't nothing left. And in terms of the dogmas, and I realized that I really wasn't a believer in any kind of meaningful sense of the word. So actually I remember the moment quite well, the moment, my born-again experience. I was reading Dan Dennett's book, Breaking the Spell. And it was right in the middle of the book, I realized, wow, the spell has been broken. And so I just stopped right there and I shot Dan Dennett an email. And he responded in like half an hour. Yeah, and I thought, wow, I've worked for Jesus for like almost 20 years and the guy never once, And Dan, here's this guy he's never heard of before, and he gets back to me right away. Wow. So I took that as a sign. And so what I'd like to do is just kind of share just a little bit more of my journey, and not just to kind of focus on me, but I think a lot of people are taking this journey, and a lot of people taking this journey, and maybe I can give you some material that'll be helpful to you in your conversations with others. And then after I do my spiel, we're going to do a little Q&A time before we head out, so I can respond directly to some of your questions. But for me, really, kind of the drift began because one of the occupational hazards of being a pastor is you spend a lot of time in the Bible. And, you're preparing sermons, leading Bible studies, and if you spend any time in the Bible at all, you begin to realize pretty quickly that things aren't really adding up. And here's just one example. And it's just little things I started to notice over the years. Because like I said, I was raised a Christian, so your entire life you approach this book through the lens that this is somehow, kind of a different, inspired, is this any other book that you pick off of the bookshelf? And you don't realize that that's the lens you're looking at. But I was working on a Bible study on the Gospel of Mark, and I noticed in Mark chapter 2, verse 26 references, Jesus actually references a story in the Old Testament when David, about 1,000 years earlier, and his men had raided the bread of the presence, holy bread they weren't supposed to eat. And Jesus was referencing this story to justify the fact that he and his men had violated the Sabbath by gleaning the fields on the Sabbath. And Jesus, when he's telling the story from the Old Testament, says, and at the time, Abiathar was high priest. But if you go back and check out the story in 1 Samuel chapter 21, it wasn't Abiathar, it was Abiathar's father, Ahimelech. Now that doesn't seem like a significant detail, but it is. Because if Jesus is supposed to be omniscient, he wouldn't have made a mistake like that. So let's just suppose he wasn't omniscient, but at least he was a really sharp rabbi. Okay? If he was a really sharp and learned rabbi, he would not have made a rookie mistake like that. They knew the Hebrew Scriptures inside and out. And so I thought, well, maybe it wasn't Jesus who messed up, but maybe it was the author of Mark's Gospel who got it wrong. Which then begs the question, what else did he get wrong? Apparently a lot. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, if you've read them, and the Gospel of John, can really hardly agree on any significant event in Jesus' life. Synoptic Gospels, when I say Synoptic, it's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They say that Jesus was crucified on the Passover, but in the Gospel of John, he was crucified on the day of preparation before the Passover. Again, not an insignificant discrepancy. And after a while, you start to wonder, maybe the guys from Monty Python were right. Maybe it really was, blessed are the cheesemakers. And all makers of dairy products, right? Remember that? And so from there, things began to snowball for me. And for the first time in my life, like I said before, you're looking at this stuff as holy, sacred, inspired. But when you start, and then pretty soon it just starts to pile up, the inconsistencies, the fabrications, the exaggerations. And you don't have to be really a biblical scholar to see this stuff. It's right there in front of your eyes. The Apostle Paul, in his letters, which comprise some 1/3 of the New Testament, does not once quote Jesus or reference his teachings or reference his miracles. Not once. Now, I know some of you are about to quibble and say, oh, wait a minute, what about 1 Corinthians chapter 11? I can see you're about to do that. Where Paul describes the Last Supper. And I don't have time to get into it right now, but when you look at that text, it's pretty clear that Paul is admitting that he kind of made the whole thing up. And then things just keep getting worse until you reach the final book, Revelation, which appears to have been written by somebody tripping on mushrooms. There's actually a lot of theories about that one. One of them is that the water on the island of Patmos was at the time at least had a high concentration of wormwood in it, which is of course one of the active ingredients in absinthe. So that would explain a lot. So after spending years in the Bible and preaching and teaching it week after week, it began to take a toll on me. How could a book like this be of any kind of reliable guide for living, much less the inspired, inerrant word of an omniscient, omnibenevolent deity? Not a chance. Now, why am I going on this little rant to a room full of skeptics who probably don't buy much of the Bible anyway? Well, I think there's some good reasons for us as free thinkers to be acquainted with the Bible a little bit and to read it. And I'll be talking about that in my blog, and I can't get into. And Kurt alluded to some education work we're going to do this summer, so we can get into that later. But one problem, and one reason we have to know more about this book is because it still has too much influence on our daily lives. Our public officials are still sworn into office with their hands on a copy of this book. Earlier this year, the Wyoming state legislature was seriously considering apocalypse preparedness legislation, which included exploring the possibility of buying an aircraft carrier. You might remember Wyoming is landlocked. Okay. The American foreign policy and military aid in the Middle East are influenced by the fact that a large percentage of the American electorate believes that 4,000 years ago a tribal god named Yahweh deeded a piece of real estate to a mythical nomad named Abraham in perpetuity. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So, and I just want to clarify there, I'm not being anti-Israel or pro-Israel. All I'm saying is make the case without mythology. That shouldn't be a factor. So anyway, that's the Bible. The next big nail in the coffin for me, moving beyond Scripture, was really just the reality of how we lived our lives in the church. And before I go on, I want to add this caveat that in no way do I want to sound flippant or condescending to the people I ministered to. I love them dearly. And what follows is not a criticism, but it's just observation of the reality of day-to-day Christian life in middle-class America. We'll get back to the Bible for a moment. Most Christians in America will say that they revere the Bible as the Word of God, and yet they do not know it and they do not read it. And in the course of 20 years of ministry, I have not met a single Christian layperson who could give me a reasonable synopsis of the narrative trajectory, even this, like, you know, the Cliff Notes outline from beginning to end. If it really were a supernatural book, a divine message of eternal truth plopped out of heaven that has relevance for everybody, you'd think it'd be like the best book ever written. It's not. You'd think it'd be like as good as a John Grisham novel, maybe, or Stephen King. And if it was really that awesomely amazing a work of meaning for humanity, you'd think we couldn't put it down. Remember years ago when, like, everybody was reading Harry Potter? It would be like that. And it was not. And the people who, and the people feel guilty about not reading the Bible because they think it's a problem with them, not with the book. And they sit down, they try to read it to please God, and they usually collapse somewhere in the middle of Leviticus. Heaven. Christians like the hope of heaven in the abstract, but when it comes to actually dying to get there, they're generally as unenthusiastic about it as everybody else. If heaven were such a palpable reality that I am rock solid, 100% sure I am going into this state of a wonderful paradise, then when a Christian is diagnosed with a terminal illness, it would not be illogical for a Christian to say, congratulations, and to throw bon voyage parties, right? Despite what Christians profess about the power of prayer, they really don't believe in its efficacy. In times of illness, prayer is seen at least as a complement to the medical arts. And aside from a few marginal groups like the Christian Scientists, most Christians seek out professional medical help, just like anybody else. And they throw in prayer on the off chance that it might do something, like aid it along a little bit. But nobody believes that prayer is going to do the whole thing. I've prayed with thousands of people. I have never seen it work. I'm just saying it. I'm tired. It ain't working. It's not working. You know, and I'm saying that out of anguish. How many terminally ill people I sat by their bed and prayed my heart out, saying, let's do something here. And for all the people that claim that prayer has healed them, they conveniently suffer from illnesses where the power of prayer is not externally visible. What I mean is, for example, prayer is not even as effective as Rogaine for healing male pattern baldness. I've tried. I did. And really, if prayer were at least as effective as Rogaine, I'd believe. I would. The point is, despite what, and here again, this is not a criticism of Christians. You understand what I'm trying to say? It's an observation that the way we as Christians were living our lives day to day, kind of, we lived as if Christianity were not an all-encompassing reality. We lived as practical atheists. Which is a tacit admission that the claims of religion are not true or real. And finally, there's what I call the mundane solipsism of congregational life. The psalmist says, keep me as the apple of your eye. And for many believers, that is pretty much the bottom line. God is busy choreographing my day planning the weather for my golf outing or my fishing trip, getting me a parking spot at the mall, stuff like that. And all the while he was busy directing your day, he somehow neglected to get minimal nutrition into the hundreds of millions of our brothers and sisters around the world who live on the brink of starvation every day. You get into ministry thinking that at least some of the time is going to be spent on an ethereal search for the truth and the great realities of life. But the reality is you spend more time dealing with issues like how to keep peace between feuding factions in the congregation. Are we going to have traditional worship or contemporary worship? Are we going to have a pipe organ or a digital organ? I know one church that solved that one by purchasing a digital organ, and then they put up fake pipes next to it. Please both factions. One example from my ministry is illustrative. Are we doing okay on time? Because I mean, we're doing good? Okay. Of all the topics I preached on over the years and taught about, the most controversial policy decision I ever made was the day I changed the communion wine. And it started like this. One day it kind of struck me that we ought to be drinking better communion wine. Because, well, I thought if, there is a God, then one of the essential divine attributes of the Lord would be that he would have impeccable taste. And he sure as heck wouldn't be drinking the swill that we were drinking. So, the budget was good, and we could afford it, so I brought in wine reps, and we assembled the staff for blind taste testing. We chose a wine, and we just switched the wine one Sunday. Oh, man. Phone rang off the hook. Had to do major damage control, spin control. I'm not making this up. This was real. And so I just said, this ain't worth it, And so the next Sunday, just went back to the old wine. Oh, so much appreciation. Emails, letters, cards. One guy called me up. Pastor, what is the name of that wine we use for communion? We like it so much, we'd like to buy a case for the house. I said, yes, it's a very special wine. Do you have something to write with? Yeah, what is it? Okay, here it is. I'll say it slowly. Mogan David. And we sell no wine before, that was Gallo, but So anyway, but those things were fairly innocuous. And there were aspects of religion that I knew were not so innocuous. And this is what really began to bother me. The big one was what we euphemistically call religious education, which is not really education at all, but is indoctrination and propaganda. Kids are smart and inquisitive and bright, and right around the time that they stop believing in Santa Claus, they start asking all the obvious questions about God. Like, well, who made him? And what was he doing before he made the world? And how did he get all those animals onto the ark? And why did God make a devil? And if God is so loving, why are all these horrible things happening in the world? All very good questions for which there are no good answers. In Sunday school, we teach well-known stories from the Bible to edify the children and strengthen their faith. But most of these stories, it took me a long time to realize this, but most of those stories that we were teaching the kids have a very sinister side to them. And they terrorize young minds. And introduces them to the fundamentally horrific and gruesome worldview that is at the heart of Christian theology as a cult of human sacrifice. And that's what it is at its heart. I'll give you an example from my own childhood. When I was in elementary school, our vocal music teacher was teaching us a song about Noah's Ark. Public school, by the way. And I vividly remember the experience to this day. I was in second grade, and we were standing on those little risers they had in the vocal music room, and she was standing there. She had big hair. It was white, big hair. She had far side glasses, and And she was telling us about the story behind the song that we're about to sing about Noah's Ark, and about how God punished all the wickedness in the world by killing everybody except for one family and pairs of all the animals which he put on the ark. And she was saying this in a pretty sweet voice, and we were following her. And then she says this, and then he put a rainbow in the sky as a sign that he would never again destroy the world with water. And then she said, and you know why he promised to do that, boys and girls? And she said, and suddenly she started to get like agitated. I remember her face got red and her eyes started to pop out, and she practically screamed, because the next time he comes, he's going to destroy the world with fire. Like, second grade. Now, granted, most Sunday school lessons are not as memorable as that one, but still many of the stories we expose the children to are just awful. Here's another one that I learned when I was a kid that I know was in our curriculum all the time. We taught about the time that God tested the faith of Abraham by requiring him to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. And what little kid hearing that story is not also going to picture them being in Isaac's place on the altar with the knife poised to strike? And I still don't get it. That story is taught as an example of God's beneficence. God basically stages a mock execution, and because he decides not to go through with the execution, he's a swell guy. And that's good news. The tradition that I was part of, there was this thing called confirmation that was very big. It's big in a lot of Christian traditions, where teenagers, after some extra preparation classes, get up and they make a public profession of their faith. And every year, throughout my entire ministry, as we approached the day of confirmation, which was always in the spring, around the day of Pentecost, the day of the Holy Festival of the Holy Spirit, I would get a frantic parent calling me saying, my son, my daughter says they don't believe and they don't want to go through with confirmation. And you've got to do something, because the invites have been set out, the caterer has been lined up, the relatives have bought their tickets to come, do something. And so, what can you do? They're paying the bills, and so bring the kid in. And we sit down and we talk, and I would try to reassure them that, doubt is a part of the spiritual journey, and it's natural not to believe everything right away, and just give it time, it will make sense, and, basically don't ruffle anybody's feathers. And what I should have said is this: yes, good for you. You're asking the right questions that nobody has an answer for. Run, Forrest, run. And very belatedly, I came to see there's nothing remotely educational about Christian education. The dogma and the propaganda essentially work to disable critical thinking and squelch inquiring minds. And I have to believe there are ramifications for our culture by doing that. Some of you may be wondering why I stuck with it so long. How can you live with the cognitive dissonance, all that kind of stuff? Well, first of all, you spend a long time preparing for ministry. And like I said, I got into it fully committed to everything. I was not as critical a thinker then, I guess. I don't know. And it was 4 years after college of, graduate school preparation, and it's a lot of money goes into that, and the thought of retooling was pretty daunting, and you got to support a family. And I thought, after all, there's plenty of other people that make their livings doing things of dubious social value, right? Big tobacco executives, the people who sell subprime mortgages, the people who developed and marketed the shake weight. Okay. Ab roller. We can go on again. And the other thing is, it wasn't all bad. That's the thing. And we have to, free thinkers, we have to acknowledge this. It's not all bad. There's a lot of good stuff. There's good fellowship. There's good music sometimes. There's service projects. I liked doing this, getting up and talking to folks and maybe make their week a little better. But probably the biggest reason I didn't leave earlier was tribalism. Over hundreds of thousands of years, our species has evolved to be an intensely tribal creature. Humans are intensely tribal. And it's really, really hard to leave your tribe, no matter what tribe that is. All my friends were in the tribe. All my family was in the tribe. I was comfortable there. And for many of us, perhaps most humans, tribal instincts can override rational thought. But I just personally reached the point where I became convinced that the cost of perpetuating the mythical dogma aspects of religion has become too great for our society. I mean, we see it all the time. Look what's been happening this year alone with, legislatures around the country with their kind of invasive, oppressive legislation that's restricting the right of women to make choices about their body, and now contraception is even on the table? I mean, was there a DeLorean parked outside? What is this? I read the New York Times every day, and I started a new file of clippings. Stories where people are killed somewhere around the world because of theology. Nearly every day in Section A of the New York Times. Nearly every day. A few years ago, I ran across a book entitled, it's a good book, Losing My Religion. I mean, you read it? It was the story of a journalist who covered the religion beat for the Los Angeles Times, and in the course of his work as a correspondent, he lost his faith, and he wrote this book. And now I see more where he was coming from. But there's something about the book that bothers me as I thought about that book. And I recommend the book, great book. But the cover of the book, Losing My Religion, it's dark, and the only image on the front of the book is this white candle with a brass candle holder, and there's a whiff of smoke coming up from the candle because it's been extinguished. And the more I think about that photo, the more I thought, no, that's not the way it is. When you lose your faith, it's not like a candle going out. It's like the light's coming on. It's like the lights at Wrigley Field coming on for the first time. You don't lose anything other than the crazy metaphorical baggage for which there is not one shred of empirical evidence. That's not losing. That's like getting rid of the luggage. You know what I mean? It's like, and pay attention to this, the way free thought is frequently expressed in the media and even by free thinkers themselves. Falling from faith. I didn't fall. I'm rising to reason. I didn't fall from faith. There's no falling. There's no losing. Christians call their message the gospel, from the Old English word for good news, Godspell, which is also kind of an English translation of the Greek word euangelion, which means glad tidings. Is where we get the word evangelism, evangelical, stuff like that. That's not the gospel. This is the gospel. Free thought is the gospel. Reason is the good news. We are not in bondage to a totalitarian deity whose expectations you cannot possibly live up to. We are free to explore reality as it is, to live our lives with intellectual honesty, with inquiring minds, with empirical truth. This is the only gospel, my friends, that will save our struggling planet. And I want to add this quick plea, because I think, as you realize, we are living in a time of unprecedented change. I mean, this is the thing. You all know about Moore's Law, and in a sense, there's kind of this, I think, a social equivalent to Moore's Law, that so we're not only changing, the rate of change in our society is increasing rapidly on so many fronts, as we heard, ranks of non-believers are growing faster than any other religious group. And the thing that has surprised me the most since my appearance on Up with Chris Hayes on the MSNBC show network is the number of Christians, lifetime church-going people, who have come up to me and said on the QT, yeah, I really didn't believe this either. And they said, I've had the same questions, but they haven't dared to say anything about it because they thought they'd be weird or they wouldn't fit into the tribe or there was not room for those questions. And I've been getting a lot of that. I've been getting phone calls from clergy from around the country who I do not know. Somebody put my phone number out on like the National Yellow Pages or something because I'm getting phone calls and they're saying they're in the same situation. And so all I'm saying is something is afoot. And as Kurt said, this is a good time to be a free thinker and just be patient and gracious with your religious friends because I think many of them are not as orthodox as they might appear, and it might surprise you. And finally, I want to say, getting back to the tribals and things, I could not have made this kind of change without people like you. Vic mentioned how I went to the Texas Freethought Convention. I wasn't going to that to make any kind of statement. In fact, I wanted to put a bag over my head. I didn't want to be seen there. But Michael Shermer was there, and Richard Dawkins was there, and these guys whose books I've been reading were there. So I thought, well, I got to hear these guys, And so I got there not knowing what to expect. No intention of really ever kind of proclaiming myself to be a skeptic, I guess. And I got there. It was the first time in my life that I'd been around so many free thinkers and agnostics and atheists and skeptics, and you weren't weird, You know what I mean? It was like, it was like this foreign tribe. I was entering this foreign tribe, and people were friendly and welcoming and gracious and amazing. And the experience at the convention was significant for me because for the first time I had a tangible example of an alternate tribe, because we are so tribal. Very few people in this world can ever leave a tribe and run off on their own to die in the savannah. You need another tribe to connect to. And when I had a vision for an alternate tribe, that's what made the difference. And so I thank you for making that possible. I thank you for taking me in. And thanks for being here and letting me ramble on for a little while tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. That's it.
Mike, I'd like to hear your thoughts on how the physical world came to be and how we came to be as human beings, rational human beings, in the physical world.
I'm not a scientist. I'm a recovering theologian. So Darwin is cool. I get, I was also a liberal arts major, so I took like one science class. But I did. I don't know where we came from. I'm a total. Evolution has blown me away. And that doesn't explain about the physical but how life came about. Evolution rocks my world every day. The more I read about it. Another big thing for me in my journey was reading about evolutionary psychology. My first introduction to that was The Moral Animal by Robert Wright, and then that led me to other books. Read some of Steven Pinker's books, and this really helped me understand how much of our psyches is rooted in our evolutionary past, and how religion has evolved in the same way that languages has evolved. And so in terms of, that's my understanding about, I completely look at the world through Darwinian lenses when it comes to life. In terms of, Big Bang and stuff like that, I'm willing to listen to the thoughts of, the great astrophysicists and what they have to say about it. And I find it fascinating, but I don't have any answers. I mean, is that okay? Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Hi, you mentioned your family. If you don't mind, would you mind talking a little bit about what was the toll or the experience you went through when all this happened?
Yeah, I'm still kind of dealing with that. Different folks have responded differently. I have, and I think we are planning to put this out on the internet, so I'd rather just, let me just say I've had to you know, some people have been very understanding and supportive, others have not, and I'm still in the midst of working through all that right now. And it's not over yet. So,
there's a good book by Bart Ehrman called Misquoting Jesus. Have you read that or seen that?
I've read some of his stuff, but I can't remember which books. Was it Misquoting Jesus?
His breakthrough book was called Misquoting Jesus, and your life seems somewhat comparable to his because he was a biblical scholar, and then in his studies came to realize that it contradicted, and he became very secular. The book is excellent for anybody that, especially the first chapter or so, that describes his personal conversion.
Yeah, it's amazing, and part of what's interesting to me is. And he had didn't he start out in a more evangelical type back? I mean, he went to, did he go to Wheaton or Moody Bible or He went to Moody, yeah.
He was kind of what you described as being very much in his tribe of evangelical people.
Yeah.
But he could read Latin and Greek, and he really wanted to study in the Bible in the way that you're talking about it. The Bible is the greatest book. That's how he felt about it. He wanted to understand everything he could about it. And he basically got kind of what is sort of a master's at the evangelical college. And then at that point, he faced a fork in the road. And he could either go to another very evangelical place to essentially get the kind of PhD in biblical studies, or he could go to the place that was clearly better, but had a lot of secular things. And his friends all advised him, don't go to those other places, don't go, you'll get corrupted or whatever. But he felt his faith was strong, and so he went to what he felt was the best place, and indeed he did get corrupted.
Yeah, he did. And you know what's fascinating to me, let me just comment on that real quickly, is I think it shows the extent to, it took a lot of study for him to get to that point where he was, a lot of study. And you don't need, all you have to do is read the book. Just read it. You don't have to learn Greek or Latin. It takes, that to me, that's an example of just what a grip the tribe has on you when it takes that much study to break through. Yeah.
I would add to that, not only read it, but compare the Gospels to each other.
Absolutely.
But my question is, as far as Jesus, he was a person that said, love thy enemy, help out the poor. Do you think there's any value in studying him, or do you think he was just a myth, made-up story?
Good question. I think the historicity of Jesus is not in doubt. I kind of feel that way. He was a historical figure. But what's happened, I don't think it's even possible to honestly get to the root of who that historical figure was, because so much has glommed onto him over the centuries. And Jesus has become a projection. And this is the other thing, is when you talk, we're even talking about, let me talk a little bit about that. I believe that Jesus has largely become a projection of, for whatever group is worshiping him or talking about him, of the values they hold near and dear to their heart. So, for example, the Golden Rule, we all know that there's analogous teachings in every major religion in the world, and this notion of doing good to others is rooted in our genetic propensity for altruistic behavior that has its roots millions of years ago. And so we've developed these formulas for talking about these things that evolved long before religion ever came along, where religion is how it got expressed. Does that kind of make sense in a way? So, and then getting to Jesus, it's what Jesus are we talking about? Are we talking about the Roman Catholic Jesus who really doesn't like masturbation and birth control? Or are we talking about the mainline Protestant Jesus who really cares about poor people but can't get around to doing anything about them? Or are we talking about the Southern evangelical Jesus who tends to vote Republican and loves the military? These are the various images of God that are believed by various Christian groups within the United States are mutually exclusive beings, Which Jesus is there? Let's take your pick.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that when you were coming out of your religiousness, you know, you kind of held back because you like the life.
Yeah.
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 So I wonder how many members of the clergy, be whatever clergy it is, do you think realize that, but just go with the flow, so to speak? Because I always wondered, I was Catholic, and I always wondered, the Catholic Church, they got to know that this is bullshit. No, really, they have to know. Because I will tell you, when I was about 16, my mom gave me a book. I don't think she knew what she was doing. And it's called In God's Name. Mm-hmm. And it was about the assassination of Pope John Paul I and how the Vatican was so involved in it. I don't know if you guys have... Anyway, so, you know, at that point, I kind of thought they have to know, you know, that this is all bullshit. But they probably go with it because they have that power, they have that influence, they have, you know, so what is your take on that? Because I know, have you ever talked to colleagues of yours, you know, who say, well, what's your take on that?
Yeah, Kurt just said, in case you didn't hear, he said he thinks that the truth, the truth doesn't matter so much. I think it's true for theological truths. I came to that conclusion a while back, that most Christians are not driven by a quest for theological truth at all, and they do not really necessarily believe what they're saying in the creed, but there's comfort in the rituals, there's comfort in the tribe. It's a comfortable... So, yeah, I think it's pretty... Oh, okay, there is a article in the latest issue of Psychology Today called The Atheist in the Pew. It's a good... It's actually on the question that you just asked, and it's a good article. So I recommend that. Yeah.
What publication?
Psychology Today, the most recent issue.
Yeah. In addition to what he said about the Vatican thinking must know that it's bullshit, that there was a Renaissance Pope, and I don't remember which one it is, who commented when showing around the Vatican and the riches of the Vatican to a member of the French aristocracy, said, "See what the fable of Christ has brought us."
When Martin Luther visited Rome on his very first and only trip to Rome, when he was a young monk before the Reformation started, he was very, very excited about going to Rome because he saw this. He was very pious, eager monk, very devout, and he saw his chance to go to Rome as like it was going to be the spiritual turning point of his life. And he got to Rome, and he was devastated by what he saw. He saw, because Rome was constantly filled with tourists coming to all the shrines, and there were priests at the altars at all these shrines for all the tourists coming in, because if you went and, you know, had a mass said at a shrine, you could get X number of years off of purgatory for departed loved ones. And when Luther got there, he heard the priests in Latin, as they consecrated the host, instead of saying, this is my body, you know, the word hoc est corpus meum, instead of using the proper Latin rubrics as they consecrated the host to become the body and blood of Christ, the priests would say in Latin, because the crowds couldn't understand Latin, mocking it, you are bread, and bread you shall remain. And they were going through the entire words of the Mass were a mockery, because the priests themselves, but they were getting paid to say masses for the pilgrims coming to Rome. And it was a turning point in Martin Luther's life when he realized that something wasn't right there. And that's one of the things that led to the Reformation. So, yeah, I mean, there's been this tension, and I guess I don't think you'd ultimately know who believes what until we can figure out a way to scan people's brains to see what they really believe, you know.
Hey, I think you did a great job of telling us that if you just read the Bible literally, there's really nothing to study. Just read it. God is telling you what he's about. There's nothing to study and nothing to find out that's so loving. He's telling you, I'm going to beat you, I'm going to turn you into salt, I'm going to, you know, turn you into stone, you know. But now that you know this and you've been through this experience as a pastor, how do you feel now when you see other pastors like Hagee or just any pastor? Or even, I'll give you a black one, T.D. Jakes.
I get something stronger.
How do you, even T.D. Jakes, how do you feel about these pastors really still trying to convince the masses that this is the way to go to find happiness and peace and this, that, and the other? Don't you want to wring their neck sometime?
It's very frustrating. And I see even before, I kind of came to my current, situation, I would see a lot of, because I still watch a lot of preachers just because I want to see what they're up to and what they're saying. And there's a lot of, not just the metaphysical garbage, there's a lot of horrible psychology that comes from pulpits, a lot of horrendous science, a lot of, I can't tell you the number of times I've heard prominent pastors get up in their pulpits and tell people they need to throw out their antidepressants because depression is just the devil working on them, and if they had a stronger faith, they wouldn't need. And people listen to them because they're in this position of authority and whatever kind of credence they lend to that. And so, there's a lot of bad stuff being said still, for sure. Yeah.
I was wondering, as your faith kind of deteriorated, did you change how you'd write your sermons and conduct your Bible studies so that you can kind of avoid the tough questions that you would get?
Well, I didn't get many. Most of the tough questions came from myself, really. Most church members don't ask really tough Bible questions. There again, that's not a criticism. It's just that the interest isn't there. I wouldn't. Okay, for example, I found myself censoring myself actually for years, because even back when I still considered myself a believing pastor, I knew truths about the Bible that I would never share from the pulpit. Like, are you going to get up on Sunday in most churches and say, well, all the best archaeologists in Israel say that the Exodus and Passover event did not happen. There's not one shred of evidence, not for lack of trying, because they basically dug up the entire Sinai Peninsula looking for like one lonely little campsite. There ain't nothing. And so am I going to get up and say, well, Moses didn't exist and Abraham didn't exist? And, so there were things for a long time I was constantly censoring myself on. There's things I wanted to talk about that were fascinating in the Bible that I would love to talk about, but for a long time I felt like people couldn't handle it, and maybe I didn't give them enough credit. Maybe they could handle it more. I don't know. But like Solomon's temple, it ain't there. There ought to be some shred of Solomon's temple. It was supposed to be one of the most magnificent buildings of the ancient world. There's nothing there. David was not a king of leading massive armies. If anything, he was a small tribal chieftain. Stuff like that. Yeah. So, I have see, you've tapped into something here.
Do Protestant ministers purposefully avoid the evil in the Old Testament and avoid teaching that and preaching about that from the pulpit? And instead spoon feed the good stuff?
I didn't shy. I used to teach a midweek Bible study, and we didn't shy away from the violence because we would work through the slaughter and the blood and see what was all there. But one of the things, you read Joshua, Judges, but so I didn't really shy away from it. I guess what my contention is that the New Testament really isn't that much better than the Old Testament. I think that's a common misperception to people. The doctrine of an eternal hell where people are tormented forever and ever and ever, that's a New Testament doctrine. It's nowhere in the Old Testament. Slavery is just as much approved in the New Testament as it is in the Old Testament. Women are just as much suppressed in the New Testament as they are in the Old Testament. And so I don't see really one as being better or worse than the other. Sometimes I throw stuff out there just to see if it bothered anybody, But of course you want to focus on, like you said, the good stuff, because that's what nobody wants to come to church to get bummed out. And we want to talk about love and peace and joy and forgiveness and inclusivity. And I was pretty liberal then, even as a believer. One of my former parishioners is nodding her head up here, so she can attest to that fact. But does that kind of answer your question? Did it help? Okay.
do you ever consider or think about going back to your church and ministering to the people in your church and let them know you'll change your heart?
Letting them know that I have changed my heart? Right, yeah. Well, it had been kind of out there in public lately, so kind of folks know it's one of the reasons I wanted to do something publicly, so as many people would know as possible. So there are interviews with me with Richard Dawkins on YouTube. The MSNBC clip is on YouTube. So I haven't been quiet about it now. I've been keeping a blog and writing on there for people to, kind of sharing my thoughts. I'm glad to speak to any group, anytime, anywhere. If you guys know a church somewhere that would like to have someone come talk to them, I'd be more than happy. And I'll do it in a friendly way. I like people. That's one reason I'm here saying what I'm saying. So I'd like to be out there and help get the word out. I would. Yeah.
What's your present thought on the soul and spirit at your present time?
On soul and spirit? The soul, that was one of the questions for me that really challenged my Christian orthodoxy, because if there is such a thing as a soul, as some entity in our psyche somewhere that has not been found, hasn't been identified, hasn't been weighed, measured, or anything, it's a theory that there's some kind of nebulous essence that transcends our number one, I'm a materialist. I think all reality is material. Every thought in our head is a chemical reaction, that there's this there's this continuum of matter and energy, that there's no kind of supernatural world. But I even would say that when I was a pastor, that everything's just patterns of distortion in the fabric of time and space. I mean, all reality is. So I am a materialist. But getting back to the soul, if there is something like that, then where in the process of our evolution was that inserted? How did that come about? And we're not the only humans. I mean, this is the thing to remember about the predecessor hominid species. They were humans too. They weren't Homo sapiens, but they were Homo habilis and Homo erectus, and then there was Australopithecus. But of course, anything with Homo as the genus is a form of human. Did Homo habilis or Homo erectus have souls? Did they need saving too? Did Lucy have a soul? And if these species were still in Neanderthal, Homo sapiens and Neanderthal lived at the same time for quite a while. And then we wiped them out. And then those of us who are Western European got stuck with some of their DNA. But did they have, their brains were bigger than ours. Did they have a soul? And so is Jesus' salvific activity on the cross retroactive to cover all of those guys? And humanity, Homo sapiens, has been around for 200,000 years. Jesus showed up in year 198,000 of our existence. What took him so long? If all those people had souls, it's a perplexing question. If there is such a thing, where did it come? When did it evolve? Why don't other creatures, other hominid species have one? So you can see I'm kind of skeptical about this whole thing.
Maybe he was just waiting for us to perfect cross-building technology. So, a little bit less theological question and a little bit more practical one. You're recently unemployed. How's the job search going?
Working on a few different things. So, if anyone has a really great job offer, let me know. I'm all ears, okay? But I am getting involved. I hope to hammer together a few different things that might allow me to make a living without working for the man. One of those being working with my friend Margaret Downey from the Center of the Society of the Freethought Society, and she's very graciously invited me to be a part of her secular celebrations program, and I love doing weddings. I find funerals meaningful, and there are a whole host of life passage ceremonies that we would like to help people with, and Margaret has a vision for expanding this to include other former clergy around the country, because up until now, it's just been her. And so I'd like to find ways to keep doing the things I love doing, only do it with honesty and intellectual integrity. Thank you.
And then in that CNBC interview, you left off with you were going to meet with your church in a week, and they were going to decide your fate. How did that conversation go?
My folks were as wonderful and gracious as you could possibly imagine, and we decided it was best to part ways because I could no longer. The Constitution of our church had in the constituting documents affirming the historic creeds of Christianity. And those are metaphysical statements that I cannot affirm. And so there was no way that I could continue to be a pastor and disagree with these documents that are in the Constitution of our nonprofit organization. So, yeah, but my folks were, they were pretty amazing. The most recent church I served was non-denominational.
I was raised in the Unitarian Universalist Church, and I was sort of wondering what your thoughts were on that organization, and had you considered working in that sort of a church setting, since they sort of teach thinking on your own. Like I was raised to question not like all religions. You're sort of taught about everything, and then sort of, you can have it your own way. Yeah,
I've heard about those guys. I mean, they sound pretty interesting to me, and it might be an option to check out. Yeah, but I'm giving thought to a lot of different things right now. Thank you.
I have encountered recently when people talk about religion, and you oppose them or you don't have the same way of thinking. Is it because they are so brainwashed that they have the Stockholm syndrome of the preacher that they can't think logically, or?
I wonder if some of it gets back to our tribal instinct again. When somebody threatens our tribe, our reactions are visceral and not rational most of the time. Think about how many of us would feel if someone, like, for example, desecrates the flag, okay, look, I can be like open now about all kinds of stuff I couldn't be open before. I'm a flaming liberal politically, but when I see someone burning the flag, I feel my blood boil. You see what I mean? So when someone threatens the tribe, when someone threatens the University of Michigan Wolverines, do not be around me, okay? But you know what I mean about the tribe? So I think we're done, okay? but maybe, and I think that's a good question. Maybe other folks have ideas about that they could share with you later. But I think that's got to be part of it. There's some things that are so emotional, so visceral, so basic to us that rational thought and rational expression get derailed. I think it might be part of it.
Okay, I want to address the gentleman's question, the one that was raised a Catholic. I came across a book a few years ago by Hilton Hotima. I think it's called Waking the World Within, and he addresses that very issue of how the church back in the day got everybody hooked on religion. So I would try it. It is. He says that's what it is, and this is a former priest.
Well, the other thing to consider about religion is that, and if you haven't read The Evolution of God by Robert Wright, I highly recommend it. The Faith Instinct by Nicholas Wade is another very good book. Any number of wonderful books out there that are non-polemical. See, this is the thing. I don't think we have to be polemical. I think we have to do battle. We just have to talk about the truth, and it'll sink in eventually. But the other thing to remember about religion is that it's evolved continually. There's a line from prehistoric religion to Canaanite religion to Israelite Old Testament religion to Christianity and now to Mormonism, and I mean it's just all morphed and changed, and there wasn't like you suddenly had the end of one religion and the beginning of another one. If you want to find some really interesting stuff, look up revisionist Islamic history. You think the roots of Christianity and Judaism are wild. Some of the stuff they're saying now about the probable roots of Islam are just amazing, and the scholars who are doing it have to operate under pseudonyms for fear of their lives. A lot of good stuff out there to read. Yeah.
Mike, I got a couple of questions. The first one, as pastor, did you talk much about the separation of church and state as a pastor?
Yeah, I did. I believed in it firmly. I thought, partly as a Christian, if you look at it from a Christian perspective, why would I want the government messing with my theology? It was part of my stance. You know, prayer in school. Well, who's going to teach my kid to pray? I mean, I can't. Am I going to agree with the theology, the person who's teaching my kid to pray in school? So I think even from the basis of a faith stance, you can come up with a very rational argument in favor of separation of church and state. I've personally always felt very firmly about that, and spoke openly about that too. Yeah.
The next question is regarding money in the church.
Mm-hmm.
It's so much of it, and it's such a great influence on our society anyway. How did you deal with that? How was your approach to the money side, and what was your teaching in terms of theology about money in the church?
Number one, I had this rule: the pastor never touches the sound system or the offering plate. You don't touch the money. Okay, if you want, just we always tried to encourage our folks to understand the broader needs in the world and how we were blessed to be a blessing to others and to encourage. I mean, we came from I've always been kind of more in that kind of social gospel strain of theology for a long time. But when it came time to raise money for projects, we did it. I've been a part of big building projects over the years. And that's been a frustration, because when you think about all the massive buildings that are on, tax-free land, that are being air conditioned all throughout the week, and they're being used like once a week. It's I started to get a little bit frustrated about the bad use of resources. There's some wastefulness there, I guess. Yeah, I was never part of a tradition where you had like the flashy, like this. Well, I wasn't going to say any names because we're being recorded, but the stuff you see on certain channels. So we were never really flush with cash, let's put it that way. Yeah.
Given that you now have left behind you Christian ethics, do you have a source of ethical advice, a book or some other thing to lean back on in place of Christian ethics?
Yeah, I wouldn't. Thank you for raising that question. I wouldn't say I've actually completely thrown away all aspects of Christian ethics. I think what I'm looking for now is how religions like Christianity and other religions of the world and other philosophies have tried to express what I think there's kind of this universal sense of. Actually, there have been a lot of interesting studies about that, how people's basic moral compasses, the way they understand solutions to moral situations, the answers are amazingly uniform for cultures around the world, even in pre-literate cultures. Some of that was covered in Steven Pinker's book, The Blank Slate. So I think all of us have some really powerful, universal, deeply ingrained ethical impulses within us, and religion was one way to express those. And so I think loving your neighbor is a great idea. Okay, there's a lot of stuff we want to affirm, for sure.
I've heard Richard Dawkins refer to himself as a cultural Christian. I'm not quite sure what he meant by it, but do you have any comment?
Yeah, that would be interesting to ask. I don't think I'd ever want to attempt to speak for Richard Dawkins on anything. He's an amazing man, a very articulate man. I was watching his debate with Rowan Williams, the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is a very good thing to watch. That's also online. It's about an hour long. And he admits at the beginning that he was singing a hymn in the shower that morning. And he quoted the first words of the hymn, and then he said, well, then it goes downhill after that. But all of us, not actually all of us, but I think I can say this. I was having a conversation with my mother, and she said, well, tell me Christianity is still a part of your life. I was like, well, it is, because it's been a part of my life for so long, and it's always going to be, there are aspects of, there are hymns, like Richard Dawkins singing the hymn. There are going to be hymns that'll be there forever. There are a lot of good things. All I'm saying is, we don't need the metaphysical garbage. We don't need the lie. We don't need to perpetuate the lies. There is something called, I have a lot of friends who consider themselves culturally Jewish, that they will still celebrate Passover and Yom Kippur, but they are non-theistic. But that Jewish identity is still, is there room for a secular Christian version of that? I mean, it's an interesting question. Yeah. Oh, you know what? And Kurt wrote a really great, your piece, I loved your piece, Kurt, on why you like Christmas as an atheist. That was in the Chronicle, right? Chron.com. Yeah, look for Kurt's piece on that. That was very, very well done.
Of course, one of the problems is that people use religions for many, many different things. One way of subdividing is that people have their personal religions to feel at peace and organize themselves. But then you have a community religion and things that try to accomplish things for the good of the whole community. Mm-hmm. And those are connected but different. Now, obviously, some of those, we could just talk with you for hours and hours, so I'll try to keep it to one thing. On the really biggest level, humanity itself, human civilization, is overpopulated the earth. There are tons of problems that the world community faces as a whole. Mm-hmm. In regards to this, there's a scientist named E.O. Wilson, who, by the way, is a former Humanist of the Year. About 4 years ago, wrote a book called The Creation, where he asserted that since science and religion are fighting each other so much, he says, well, no, it's really not that way, and pretty much a lot of people basically have the same goals. So why don't we get science and religion working together to save the environment and deal with the problems of human civilization? So could you comment on that?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of E.O. Wilson. If I ever stop being a skeptic, I might worship him at some point. He's amazing. I've read Consilience, and I just read his latest book, The Social Conquest of the Earth, which I highly recommend, 2 thumbs up. I think he's saying some amazing things that the world needs to listen to. He poses interesting questions, and he doesn't offer any pat solutions, but he offers a possible way. And I think people in the religious world would be very, very good to read him. I do want to share one of my favorite quotes from that book, his latest book, The Social Conquest of the Earth, where he says, we are a Star Wars civilization with Stone Age emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And he said that explains a lot right there. Yeah.
You mentioned that you believe that Jesus is a historical figure. Mm-hmm. So what do you think happened after the resurrection?
Well, yeah, that's a huge topic. The reason I keep going back to Paul is that Paul's letters are the earliest Christian writings we have. They predate the Gospels by decades. So it's the earliest glimpse we have of anything that Christians said about Jesus. Paul does not mention a physical bodily resurrection of Jesus. He mentions a spiritual resurrection, just like this kind of vision type thing. No empty tomb, no women at the tomb, no angel at the tomb, no rock rolled away from the tomb, nothing like that in Paul, who also does not mention a virgin birth. Some of these things seems to have come about later as early Christianity was marketed, and part of the marketing entailed tacking on aspects of Roman mystery cults. There were other gods that had death and resurrection stories, communal meals. Dionysus is one that comes to mind right away. The Mithraism is another one. And so I think a lot of those elements come in later. But that's just like oversimplified, but that's all I can do right now. Thank you.
All right, well, I think unless anyone else has questions.
We have one more.
Okay.
This is the last one.
Hi.
Hi.
You said you went to theology school and even graduate school, and you eventually had questions about contradictions in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could elaborate more on your education and how did it prepare you, or rather fail to prepare you for these questions that it seems almost inevitable to have?
Yeah. I did my undergraduate work at the University of Michigan. I went to seminary at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, and that's a 4-year program. It's a standard program that most mainline pastors go through after college to prepare for ministry. You typically study things like church history, scriptures. You study Greek, Hebrew, something called systematic theology, which I now know does not exist. And it's an oxymoronic term, actually. Part of what's happened there is I think part of what's happening is that, for me personally, the world of science has changed so fast, so rapidly, and people in the world of theology, for the most part, haven't attempted to keep up with anything. For example, if you were going, we now know a lot about the neurology of belief. People like Michael Shermer have written, Why People Believe Weird Things, or The Believing Brain, and there are certainly a lot of other books out there. It seems like someone who's preparing for a career in the belief business, it would help to understand something about the neurological mechanisms of belief, and yet that's never addressed. I mean, there's so many aspects. Evolution was never addressed, and now I understand evolution explains everything. Everywhere you look in this world, any form of life, you just keep coming back to evolution, evolution, evolution. And that's not really, and I did if you go to the Dawkins Foundation, it's richarddawkins.net, I have an article on the front page under Richard Dawkins Originals, which talks about how my understanding of, you remember Richard Dawkins' famous illustration of climbing Mount Improbable as explaining, to me, how that image alone challenges virtually every core doctrine of Orthodox Christianity without even trying. So maybe it's not talked about because it's too dangerous. I don't know. But for me, I kind of like to read, and that's what happened. That's what happens when you read. Yeah, and think. Good. Great. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.
Okay, that was so wonderful. Thank you very much, Mike.